Excellent. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff Berkowitz from Real Endpoints. Really appreciate Saks having us here. David and I were just speaking. It's hard to believe that this is the first annual obesity conference because it feels like obesity has been here forever and has certainly taken over the conversation and dialogue in healthcare and the pharma industry and the payer side. Today, we're going to explore a little bit of that. We have an incredible privilege to have a very powerhouse panel. I can't imagine a group of people better suited to have this conversation this morning. So we thought just because the backgrounds are so incredible, we'd take just a couple of minutes with some brief introductions and then get right into the conversation. So,
good morning. My name is Tim Opler. I'm an investment banker at Stifel. I happen to be just really interested in this obesity area. I have so many friends and family members whose life have been transformed in the last couple of years by these GLP-1s, and so just kind of captured my imagination. And I can't imagine a better thing to do on a Saturday morning than to talk about how big this market could be and what it might mean for our society.
Good morning, everyone. David Kendall. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Zealand Pharma. A physician by background. I've spent almost 40 years in diabetes, obesity, and metabolism. And have previously served as a clinician investigator at the University of Minnesota. Also spent time at a little biotech called Amylin Pharmaceuticals down in San Diego, and had the pleasure of working for and with Enrique for 7 years at Eli Lilly.
Very good. Great to see so many familiar faces. Very much appreciate the invitation. My name is Enrique Conterno. I was the head of Lilly Diabetes and Obesity for about 10 years, from basically 2010 all the way to the end of 19. I took a brief stint as a biotech CEO at Fibrogen for about 3 years. And after that, I've been joining a few boards. One of them is Zealand Pharma, so I'm here reunited with David. So look forward to some of this discussion with this very impressive panel. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Kent Rogers. I'm currently the CEO of a company called Everyone Medicines, which is in the rare disease space. But I think I was invited on the panel because I've been on multiple sides of the proverbial desk in our industry. I do represent a bit of the payer perspective here, even though I don't currently work for United Health Group. I ran the formulary strategy and procurement function for about 6 years there, and was neck deep in the obesity launch of drugs, as well as, of course, diabetes, which is the precursor to this as well. So happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks. And as I said, I'm Jeff Berkowitz. I've really spent the past 30 years dedicated to market access, pricing, and reimbursement, but worked throughout the verticals in healthcare, 13 years at Merck, 5 years at the Walgreens Boots Alliance in retail pharmacy, and then at United Health Group, running Optum's international business and strategy for the PBM. So I like to say I'm scarred by the disconnects in the healthcare system between the pharmaceutical industry and the rest of the healthcare supply chain. And I think that's certainly a topic that will come up this morning. But David, I thought maybe we'd start with you to, especially since we're the first panel of the morning, to maybe set some context for where we are right now in the market. We were saying it's only been 3 years since the launch of an obesity drug, and what's happened and where we are and why we're having this dialogue around its impact on the healthcare system.
Yeah, happy to, Jeff. And I think everyone here appreciates just how significant the obesity epidemic is and the magnitude of this problem. It's unlike any I've seen, and I've worked in the diabetes space, which was considered a tsunami of healthcare demand 15, 20 years ago, as we were developing what I will call the current generation of diabetes therapies. And this affects all segments. As a clinician provider, we will have patients who approach us for weight loss, whether it's aesthetic or therapeutic. But the absolute numbers of individuals, we were talking beforehand, Kent, Enrique, and I, upwards of 10% of kids under the age of 8 are overweight and obese. Probably closer to 20% of preteens are affected. And depending on where you go in the world, somewhere between 40 and 70% of people are going to be affected by this. I think the other thing that now drives the conversation as we've seen with semaglutide, reducing cardiovascular risk, cardiovascular risk factors, as well as the data with tirzepatide and its approval as a treatment for obstructive sleep apnea, an incredibly common problem complicated by overweight and obesity. You now start to see the downstream clinical effects of these therapies, which takes it out of the stigma, if you will, of overweight being lazy, overeating individuals, but in fact, part of the environment to which we're exposed. So we will be treating, literally hundreds of millions of people for overweight and obesity as therapies come in. And I think, Jeff, the comment you made, which is this is an incredibly immature market. Liraglutide was approved, 6 years ago, but it was underutilized. It's really only in the last year and a half to 2 years that we've seen very effective therapies with semaglutide, tirzepatide, and the follow-ons.
Enrique, you look like you wanted to jump in there for a second. So maybe, taking more of the commercial side, having shepherded this through Lilly and what it's meant for that company and the market and where we are right now.
Sure. So I had the privilege of being at Lilly when we decided that we were going to enter obesity. And I think it's probably just important to think about the environment at that time. The AMA only recognized obesity. Some people don't realize this. Basically, I think it was 2013. And many people were unconvinced whether this was a true disease. And there may be still some people that are thinking that way, but that's changed very, very fast because we have seen that obesity is associated with so many comorbidities. And not only that, but treating it, we know now that you can basically, whether it's treat sleep apnea or protect against cardiovascular risks. To me, I think we are basically in the very early innings of obesity and what basically we could do. I think the biggest challenges, quite frankly, is going to be how do we ensure that people have access to these medicines that are so promising. I actually think there's a really good value proposition for obesity medicines, in particular with all these comorbidities that we could be treating at the same time. That doesn't mean that we're going to be able to just pay for it because some of those benefits are going to come down the line. But we need to start thinking about how do we ensure that there can be better coverage for some of these medicines. Coverage today is really, really low. Despite that, we've seen an explosion. I expect, and people often ask me, how big is this market going to be? I do my own private forecast. I believe that this market will be 10 years from now. I peg at about $200 billion. I'm probably in the conservative side relative to most people. But my forecast is probably a lot larger on the volume side than most people, but also with the price that is a lot lower than what most people believe is going to be. So I expect that this is going to be a massive market. And we are in the, as I said, in the very early innings of obesity.
Tim, do you want to comment on the market size?
Yeah, getting to 200 billion is not difficult. So if you just go ask people in our society, how much would you pay for a drug that would cause you to lose a significant amount of weight? They'll give you answers. Not surprisingly, the answer you get is very much related to the person's income and wealth. And so just on the consumer side, if you will, this aesthetic market, people want to lose weight so they look better. Mathematically, that's a $200 to $400 billion market. The payer market is harder to assess because we don't really know what payers are willing to pay for. But I agree with Enrique. The benefits of these obesity drugs are profound, and I do think that we will see 100 billion plus payer market. Who knows? But it's a very large market.
Enrique, maybe just before we get Ken's perspective on the payer side, you mentioned, everybody sort of mentioned whether or not there'll be payer. uptake, and you talk a little bit about pricing. How much work and dialogue maybe inside went into your thoughts of how disruptive this might have been, and what conversations you needed to have with payers early on, or did that end up happening later? How much planning went into that? And even from a clinical trial perspective, how much work went into focusing on the outcomes that would be interesting to a payer from a reimbursement perspective?
I did have these conversations with payers. At the Lilly executive committee, they were basically saying, listen, we need to have this conversation. I did have, and they basically told me, we're not going to cover that. That was the, but there were a lot of questions at that time. And some of those questions were questions that honestly I couldn't have answered, and most people couldn't have answered, which was, okay, what is going to be the real benefit of utilizing these products in all of these comorbid conditions? People say, well, that was obvious. Well, it wasn't that obvious until we started getting the results from, I think it was initially with Novo Nordisk on their CBE for not for people with diabetes, but just for people that were just obese. So I think at that time there was some work which I have also seen recently, which to me I think spoke to the consumer nature of this market, which is really interesting. But if you were to ask somebody with just obesity versus somebody that has both obesity and diabetes, how much are they willing to pay for an obesity drug? And you present to them a product X with a certain profile. The person with obesity was willing to pay 5x what the person with obesity and diabetes was willing to pay for losing the weight. And you have to ask, I thought initially this was just way off. How this doesn't make sense to me. You're getting two benefits in one case and only one benefit, but the aspect of people with obesity have been dealing with all these challenges. They know that it's not healthy for them. They want to lose the weight. So the willingness to pay out of pocket is very, very high, probably also because they've been paying out of pocket for other types of obesity type of interventions. So to me, I think we were thinking about that aspect, and I think we need to be thinking of this market probably a little bit differently than most markets, just because of the willingness of consumers to pay. And maybe there has to be a solution that is, as Tim was basically mentioning, that basically takes into account that for us to be able to fully cover. And we do recognize that at the end of the day, we do need solutions for different income levels, and we need to think about how do we at the end cover as many people as we can, because the benefits are really substantial for society.
And just to jump in, Enrique, I sit on the board of a company that helps to sell obesity drugs in the compounded market online. That company sells roughly $15 in pharmaceutical products per minute at this point, and it's growing at 30% a month. So and that's like one company. It's not the only one doing it. I've looked at the geographic distribution of the sales. They're basically California, Boston, essentially the coast. So there's relatively modest sales into the middle of the country, particularly in the southern tier. Obesity is predominant in the southern tier of the United States. Of course, it's everywhere, naturally, but you really see high amounts of obesity, Mississippi, Alabama, those kind of places. They're not accessing this market. And it does strike me that there needs to be a conversation about how do we get obesity drugs to those that frankly need them.
Yeah, and so much to unpack here, right? The different populations' access to consumers' willingness to pay. Right now, payers are just completely putting the brakes on this, right? They've learned lessons from the PCSK9s and hepatitis C, and they've been really effective in stopping it or really focused on very niche populations right now. But there's also this conundrum of you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. We know that there are extraordinary healthcare savings to be had if you can connect the dots between taking an obesity med and other outcomes, but it's really hard for payers to do that, right?
It is, and give just a little bit of a history behind it too, and similar to what Enrique had mentioned in terms of even recognizing obesity as a disease state and treating it as a disease state. In 2016 is when some of the contracting really first started with the available medicines that were not overly effective. 5, maybe 10% loss in body mass index was considered about the best you could do beyond some medications that were indicated for post-bariatric surgery or to prevent bariatric surgery. And those were difficult medications to try to take. So from a payer perspective and trying to think about how they look at the world, which I know often is very misunderstood, is that it's a population-based view that is forward-looking. So in order to actually sell a benefit to an employer that may be a 50-person employer or 50,000 employees, they're trying to manage the spend of both drug and medicine over the course of time. And when they procure a new insurance contract, if they were selling that today, they're looking at starting in 26, 27, and 28. That's typically a 3-year contract. So they have to predict what's going to be spent in 26, 27, and 28. Obesity was probably the biggest surprise to ever impact the industry. I don't think anyone really had any idea how quickly and how voraciously both consumers as well as just the zeitgeist in our country would grab onto obesity, and primarily because these are very effective products. So we went from maybe a 5%, possibly close to 10% loss in BMI to 15, maybe even 20% loss in BMI. That effectiveness, as well as the fact that you had juggernauts like Novo Nordisk and Lilly launching the drugs, created an entirely new view and frankly, a new opportunity for us to go after that, and from a science perspective. In terms of what that means, when you're considering what the actual spend on a disease state might be, whether that's in the medical spend or in the pharmacy spend, then you set a premium for an employer based on that spend. This was an unpredictable spend. It was not put into the estimate. And so it's going to take probably a good 12, 18 months. You're just now starting to see payers get their head around the idea that I'm going to have to charge more to our customers, our employer sponsors, because frankly, this will have unincreased spend for you. So it wasn't just payers that were saying we're not covering it. It was also employers saying, how do I cover this? I can't afford this today. I'm already spending close to 20% of my revenue on the healthcare of my employees. I'm already approaching a place where I don't know if I can even cover healthcare for my employees. Now I've just injected obesity as part of that. And just to quote a couple of things, because I think we're talking about the market and how large it could be, I would posit it's the largest market we'll have had in the history of healthcare. And there's a couple of reasons why, not just because of the adults, but Rob Califf did a testimony, and he's done quite a number, but outgoing FDA commissioner was in front of Congress last month. And if we're thinking that this is an adult disease, we need to avail ourselves that it is not. Just a few quick things. The food industry, which I know we can't unpack that in this panel, but the food industry is really feeding this boat. And now we've got a drug industry that's trying to treat the effects of it as well. So that'll be an interesting interplay in the future. They spend $14 billion annually to advertise unhealthy foods, with $2 billion focused on advertising to children. Children now see 4,000 ads per day. Per year. That's 10 ads per day for unhealthy foods. Now add phones to that, and it's probably twice that. 14 million children in our country have obesity. 1 in 10 have type 2 diabetes. And that translates to about 38% of adults that are eating an unhealthy diet. So if we think the market's not going to grow, we've got a new generation that's moving right into that. So I would posit as we start to get into this that payers certainly recognize it, what to do with it, how to price a premium to an employer base. We are seeing the very beginnings of how we're going to manage that. And I would posit that the premiums we spend today and how we view healthcare today, we will be spending a lot more on our own premiums for healthcare in order to tackle this the way it probably will have to be tackled, which is with multiple modalities, not just the first gen that you're seeing today.
If I can, Jeff, thanks, Kent. 2 comments. I'll try to keep these more clinical than business related. One is this concept of obesity as a disease. A disease is something that occurs whether it's environmental contributions, genetic contributions, or a combination. This is both. No one wakes up on their 5th birthday and commits themselves to gaining, 3 to 5 BMI points. And the College of Endocrinology in the U.S. has a really nice statement, a simple one, which is adiposity-based chronic disease, ABCD. This is not obesity. These are adiposity-based chronic diseases. And to Kent's comment, what the downstream effects, I don't think any of us, including the clinicians, have started to posit or even estimate what could happen if we are effective at intervening. So you treat lipid disorders, you prevent heart disease, maybe stroke. You treat hypertension, you prevent stroke, perhaps heart disease. You treat diabetes, you prevent the microvascular complications. With adiposity-based chronic disease, there are probably conservatively 100, more likely 200 diseases, including heart disease, the progression to type 2 diabetes, sleep apnea, metabolic disease-associated liver disease. So you start to calculate the downstream potential benefits. I think it was the tirzepatide data. You see the reversal of moderate to severe sleep apnea in 94% of individuals. So suddenly you've rid yourself of CPAP, sleep studies, all of these interventions. Now do that for 100 downstream diseases. The clinical benefit and the potential medical benefit, I won't say financial benefit, is immense. And I think we have to start thinking about a complete sea change on what could be prevented clinically and from the standpoint of payers and insurance costs. I would much rather treat something upstream and save myself 100 chronic diseases than treat those 100 chronic diseases 3 to 5 years from now.
So Kent and maybe Enrique, how do you connect the dots then, right? Because you guys are both saying two very different things. Ken, you're, and I could see we've been trying to convince Pharma of the power of payers and the importance of getting your strategies right and working with them for 30 years now. But you could see people's eyes glaze over and say, I've got this powerful drug, I'm going to charge this much and the system should pay for it. You're talking about sort of employers struggling with payment and insurers not wanting to cover it and prices going up. But David's, sharing with us all the potential cost savings. So how do you get over that sort of short-term employer focus to that longer-term vision of how we can save costs across the system?
So to put the question in context, which is at the core of the issue, is that if we think of how the drug industry has evolved in just maybe the last 15 years, most primary care products such as statins, SSRIs, PPIs, these were $3-4 billion drugs in their heydays that are now mostly generic. You go to the grocery store to get your prescription or the pharmacy, 90% of your prescriptions plus are generic because that ecosystem has evolved that way over time. New technology comes, it has its day for 7 or 10 years, goes generic, and then that largely becomes much more affordable from the standpoint of a copay, and hopefully patients continue to take that. Specialty came in around 2008, 2009, matured in the 2010s, and is now well over 50% of the spend, even though it represents maybe 1-2% of the prescription volume. And now that's largely going biosimilar. Humira, Stelara, a lot of these major blockbuster drugs now have biosimilar competition, the generic version, if you will, of the biologics. So these large ecosystems and evolution of drug spend has been working its way through the system. And because of new technology in this particular disease state, it's now injected a brand new element. We're battling with what is cell and gene therapy going to be, $4 million price tags for some products. How do we manage that? This was a blindside. It came out of the primary care space and it is prolific. It is epidemic, right? All of the words that you could use to show the size of the market. So for a payer as well as their employer sponsors to get their head around, how do we pay for this? I would posit this is so much larger than one particular disease states because of the comorbidities, that the longitudinal view of how we would save as a result of this intervention, unfortunately, it's going to have to play out over a good 10 or 15 years. Like you could say, and this is just the payer, not necessarily the payer view, but the population health-based view, sleep apnea, yes, it will go down. we all know when we're laying on our back and we're going to be snoring. And if you're large and you're overweight, it's hard to sleep on your side. So if you lose weight, you can sleep on your side. Chances of sleep apnea going down are better. Simple logistical things like that are elements to this can be taken into account, but they have to be proven, they have to be quantified, and then there can be policies that are created that defend the spend. So if you go to IBM and you say, look, we're going to have an obesity program, we're going to cover all these drugs, they should be at a $0 copay because you want to influence your employees to lose weight. The employer, not the payer, will be the one that will ask, how can I afford that? That's all of my employees. I mean, I'm going to get people coming to my company because we have this assertive of a policy with these obesity products. I can't afford that. Well, but it will save you an X, Y, and Z. That argument needs to be matured and made and also proven. It's not that it's not true, but it will take time. And while that's happening, new modalities are coming out, more medications are coming out. So you're having to absorb even the improved efficacy as well as what the offset to cost will be.
Enrique, did you want to comment, Enrique?
No, my sense is maybe there needs to be a creative solution, to try to do this, and probably one where maybe there is some sort of opt-in, or whereby we try to isolate, okay, what is the true cost of the plan without obesity, to employers, and then have a program that is basically maybe an obesity program where actually we could have employees pay more out of pocket. I'm not sure the zero is necessary in this case, or even $20 or so. My sense, there could be we need to be practical, and to me, I think part of the practical here would be to come, just recognize where the environment is and have a solution that basically acts, at least on the employer side, as employees to basically, which would be willing to basically pay larger copay than they're typically expected for, let's say, a diabetes medicine.
Well, that is the idea. That is actually, I think, how the market will play out. Obesity medications up until recently had been on a rider, and if you're familiar with that, really basically is it's very much what Enrique just mentioned. Here's what your premium will be based on the medications that we deem are the most effective and the most relevant for your employee population. If you want these other medications that used to be called lifestyle medications, then this will be what your premium is. Obesity will be probably 98% of that rider now. And so being able to go to an employer and give them the choice, that will also motivate the employer to say, well, what do I do to make sure that the money we spend in that premium set actually affects our employees in a good way? So I would posit that if this is the effort that we need to go after, it's not just a medication fix. It's clearly a food industry fix, but it's also an employer fix in terms of how am I going to actually help augment the efficacy of these products by making sure my employees are persistent with the medication? Do I incentivize them to lose weight in multiple ways, right? Reduce the premium if they can show that. But that's a complicated issue. Although our lives are online a lot more now than they used to be, do I want my employer to be involved in my weight loss? Do I want my employer to incentivize me that my BMI is better? And do I get a raise if that happens? I mean, there's a lot of very interesting and maybe fantastical questions that come from that. But there's no doubt that it's not just solved through a drug technology. It has to be multiple modalities that solve this.
Couple of comments on your statement, Kent, which I agree with. We're going to have to try to estimate and then demonstrate these benefits. But even in a market that I'll still say is 2 to 3 years old, we've demonstrated a 15 to 20% reduction in cardiovascular risk. We've demonstrated a 90% reduction in the rates of moderate to severe sleep apnea. We've demonstrated about a 2/3 reduction in the progression and perhaps regression of metabolic disease-associated steatohepatitis. So the data are there to start at least to begin these calculations. I'm old enough or experienced enough where Kent made me go through prior auth for statins, for ACE inhibitors, probably for PD5 related treatments. And, the employer is now involved in your hypertension, your lipid disorder, your mental health disorders, probably your erectile dysfunction. So to get them involved in obesity maybe isn't a huge stretch. But I also would say the expectations are shifting so fast. For those of you who follow this, CagriSema, the Novo combination therapy, achieved 22.3% weight loss in a population, and the world just, roasted them. And I thought, what has happened? I mean, 5% weight loss 3 years ago was pretty darn good, and now 22.5% is, profoundly disappointing. For those of you who don't know the data, non-medical interventions to achieve more than 10% weight loss are successful in about 6% of people. So just, think about that. That means 94 out of 100 will never get there. I would argue that with tirzepatide and CagriSema, we're talking about 80-90% of people who will achieve 10% weight loss or more. So the script is flipping so quickly that I don't think we can do the calculations in real time, but we need to be slightly more urgent about them.
I have another question for you, David. Today, we're largely in a GLP-1 obesity world, and it's working well. There's a lot of new stuff coming online. So we've got amylin type drugs that are in development. We have these GPR75s that look really interesting. We have muscle drugs that are in development. How do you see this market evolving from a clinician's perspective? What new options will we have available for patients that we don't have today in the future?
I have long been, and I did the first study of an amylin agonist in overweight and obesity in 2006. So that's 19 years ago. It works. So I think the surrogates for me are probably hypertension and diabetes as the best examples. This is not a one-hit disorder, adiposity-based chronic disease. And right now, I think we see the world as GLP-1 deficient because all we have is GLP-1s to treat this. But amylin agonist, GPR75, the preservation of lean or restoration of lean mass, and multiple other mechanisms, to me, will undoubtedly be necessary. The proportion of people with type 2 diabetes who benefit from a single drug, given how complex that disease is exceedingly small, probably less than 20%. So combination therapies. It's also worth noting that about 10% of people who get sema or tirzepatide don't lose 5% or more of their body weight. So GLP-1 isn't the sole answer. About a third of people who start on a GLP-1 stop it within the first month or two, and probably that is predominantly tolerability related. So you will get none of the benefits to demonstrate to Kent this works if you don't take the drug. So I think we need options. If a third of the world won't or can't take it, now you're talking about 1 billion people who need something else. And full disclosure, we Zealand have 2 GLP-1 based therapies, one with BI, one our own wholly owned asset. We also have an amylin based agonist. So I am profoundly biased because it supports me and what I tell Enrique and the board about what we do. But we know they work. These other mechanisms will work and will, in my way of thinking, just like SGLT2s and GLP-1s and insulin and sulfonylureas and metformin work in diabetes, require multiple approaches, multi-pronged. This is a complex, multifaceted metabolic disease.
So just with the changes and with what you just laid out, David, and then, Ken, your comments about being surprised as a payer, it's always a little bit surprising to me to hear both sides of that argument because the payers are looking at pipelines. They know what's coming out. They know what's being worked on. Maybe it was the size and scale of it. But as we think about what David just shared and Enrique, and interest in your views as well, how do we align? You talked about maybe doing things more creatively. We know there's a huge consumer component to this, a food component. This is really different than anything that we've ever seen, Kent, as you laid out from a pharmaceutical company perspective in terms of its impact on healthcare. So how does the ecosystem prepare for that in a different way, so you don't have this surprise, and we can get to a place where everybody's cooperating and working together towards the same result, including compliance and adherence, David, which I think is one of the big issues here.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about all of it is that obesity is being taken seriously now from a payer perspective, as well as just from a societal perspective as well. I mean, I think we've oftentimes looked at obesity as a more morbidly obese as the issue. And now we've started to realize that obesity is actually much more of a nuanced, defined disease state than before. There is no doubt that the competitive environment of being able to sell insurance products means that you'll have to have a defined benefit to address this issue. There's no way around that. I would say there's probably no less than 10 modalities that will start to emerge in the technology space beyond what we're seeing in this first generation. So that means you're going to have a dozen companies or more coming into insurance companies saying, this is the new way to go about this. Combination products that may actually cross different modalities with other disease states, diabetes obviously being the most logical one. So I would say you're going to see the next decade a maturing market that's both going to be on the education perspective, challenge the efficacy of the products and what the resulting cost savings would be. Is there cost savings? And that's going to be a healthy debate that's going to have to play itself out while coverage policies are being created at the same time. But where I see the positive in that is that 4 years ago, it was a non sequitur. Obesity wasn't even considered on the radar, much less medications that would be effective in that area. So while they do know the pipeline, and I think that the estimate was, 10, 15%, that's great, but people don't take these medications, at least they haven't been. And even if they work better, will they continue? I don't think anybody was at least adequately seeing that the reaction to these medications would be as swift and as broad as it has been as well. Insurance, no doubt, will catch up. This will be on and covered in one form or another. I would posit that will have an impact on premiums, though, because there's no way around the size of the market being that influential.
One thing to keep in mind is that for somebody that is starting an obesity medicine, they're highly motivated to try to basically stay on the medicine, to lose the weight. It's highly visible. You can basically see your progress. So there's a lot of reinforcement. But it's estimated that maybe up to 70% of people that start a GLP-1 basically in 12 months, you are no longer basically compliant with the therapy. For the most part, this is related to the tolerability of. So clearly, there is room for thinking about not just the current generation of products, but what's going to be the next generation. I think if you look at most commentary today, there's a lot of focus in what I'm going to call the Olympics of weight loss. How much weight loss can you? It seems like we're on an Olympic race. 25%, 27% is better. My personal view is probably above 20% placebo adjusted. I think from a consumer perspective, I'm not sure that it really matters. To me, I think it's going to be a lot more about the next generation is going to be about the quality of the weight loss. And that includes how effective, what is the effectiveness of these therapies. And by effectiveness, you have to take into account how whether, out of 100 people that start, is it only 30 or is it 50 or 70 that are on therapy 12 months later? So today, I think we are in what I'm going to call in a universe that is GLP-1 foundational. So you have a GLP-1 is a foundational component. You can add other hormones like GIP or glucagon, or in the case of cagrilintide, you can add amylin. I think there's a huge case to be made, and it's the reason I joined Zealand, for thinking about amylin-based therapies as amylin being the foundational component. And can you deliver a more tolerable profile? Can you achieve a weight loss that is going to be competitive enough? And can you basically look at, of course, you can still pursue combinations, but to me, I think that's something worth thinking about. And I'm sure, and there are other efforts beyond amylin. I see a few faces here of people that are pursuing therapies for weight loss that are focused not as much on appetite or satiety, but much more on thinking about how do we increase energy expenditure. So a lot of room, I think, for us to think about innovation when it comes to obesity long term.
Yeah, Jeff, if I can, back to your comment, Tim, and following on Enrique's, I think the quality of weight loss, which we've seen, have pluses and minuses, for example, in the bariatric space, and the mechanism by which we achieve it. For those of you who've known or understand the GLP-1 based therapies, food aversion is a very different signal than fullness or satiety. And I always use the analogy that food aversion is the day after a binge. It's a hangover. I don't care to eat or drink ever again. Whereas satiety is I have the desire to sit down and have a bite to eat, but I've had enough. That experience and the, I'll say usability, not tolerability, but utility of these therapies will also require multiple mechanisms. It's one of the reasons Enrique and I, as well as Jeff, have focused on amylin because it is a different mechanism, but I think there are multiple ones. The other is that quality of weight loss. There was a report a few months ago that individuals who lose significant amounts of weight on GLP-1 based therapies lose an older adult's period of time muscle mass in the 68 to 78 weeks of therapy, meaning muscle mass declines as much over a year and a half of obesity therapy with GLP-1s as it does for somebody between age 60 and 80. That, for many, won't be desirable. So I think the multiple mechanisms will also speak to some of that. Plus, targeting these comorbidities may require a second signal, again, as we've learned from hypertension and diabetes in particular.
I have a philosophical question for any of the other panelists. So let's just say this really does turn out to be a $400 or $500 billion market 10 years from now. The global pharmaceutical market in total is around, say, $1 trillion. So it becomes a third of the market. There are a number of pharmaceutical CEOs, when asked the question, say we do not intend to go into the obesity market. We've seen the structure of the industry change fairly dramatically. So Eli Lilly, which Enrique, when you were there, was hanging on to the bottom of the top 10 of the industry by value, today is by far the top company in terms of valuation. What does this obesity drug area mean for the future of the pharmaceutical industry? I'd be curious to just hear any opinions.
It's an interesting question because if you were to have asked this question 10 years ago, I think people would have said, listen, you cannot be a pharmaceutical company unless you are involved in oncology somehow. That's where a huge part of the growth is going to come. The way I typically think about this question, you have to couple a few things. You have to couple the advances in science. What are the unmet needs? And with really and then with the capabilities of the company too. If you were 10 years ago, if you wanted to be and you were looking at participating because the science was there and clearly a number of different targets. So being present, and you needed to have the capability, but being present in oncology and immunology was really, really important. Most people would have said diabetes was an area to exit, okay, and less profitable, very difficult, really expensive to commercialize. The reality is the two most valuable pharmaceutical companies today by market cap are Lilly and Novo Nordisk. And the reason why we have obesity medicines is because they were involved in diabetes. And that's a topic for a different discussion. But if you are a CEO today, I think it's difficult to think about why wouldn't you want to participate in that, what is going to be a humongous opportunity. And you're probably coming to one of two conclusions. One is this is not going to be long-lived, which I disagree. I think there's going to be a huge obesity market 10 years from now, and one that is 20 years from now. So why not get involved? But you gotta be thinking about where I would say where the puck is going and not where it's at today. So you have to project, how to make sure that you as a CEO, you can compete in this market 5-10 years from now, as opposed to just do follow-on products or that are in an extremely competitive market. If you take into account the size of this market, I think it almost becomes a no-brainer that you need to build a capability to try to compete.
Yeah, I'll just add to that because I think what Enrique said, just the last of his comments, is the most important. And I think the panel after this is about deal making in this space. And this is the very beginning of it, right? When we see two major, arguably similar products in two juggernauts in Novo and Lilly become this successful this quickly, then everybody wants to rush into the space. What I would hope does not happen is that we find what we did in oncology. Keytruda was arguably probably the most successful product to treat solid tumors in the history of the last 20, 30 years, maybe Gleevec before that in terms of the revolutionary part of it. There are 8 PD-1s now, 8. So are we going to have 20 GLPs? Are we going to have different modalities? I think the fun part now is going to be the competition to try to find the next modality that has the easiest way to administer, the most effective in terms of its ability to lose weight. I think there's probably going to be at least a plateau somewhere in there. 20% is going to have to be the ticket to entry at this point. But that's, to me, where the real fun is going to be in how we find new modalities to treat this. Hopefully we don't have 8, 9, 10 in the same modality, because I don't think that's going to disserve the patient population, certainly, but it's also going to mire the evolution of this category into trying to find a better solution to it.
Yeah, I do agree with both Enrique and Kent in the, what's the magnitude of weight loss desirable? Actually, it turns out that about 80% of people who are overweight or obese want to lose between 10 and 20% of their body weight. People don't come in and say, I'd like to lose 100 pounds. And I think the vast majority of the benefits we're seeing, at least now, come in that 10, 15, 20% range. So Enrique's Olympics, while I think it gets a lot of investor interest and gets a lot of press, think of the number of people pre-GLP-1 era who've lost 15% of their body weight and kept it off. It's a pretty small number in my little community. So I think those are the prices of entry. And then downstream, and back to your comment, Tim, on, why was nobody in this game? You see Merck getting into the game. You see AZ announcing entry into this game. Roche bought a GLP-1 based therapy. Was it Metsera announced their IPO? So, this happens on a daily basis, not a weekly or monthly basis anymore.
I think, Tim, just also, since you framed your question as a philosophical one, I think also just increasing the aperture a little bit is hopeful that this has such a profound effect on so many things, the payer, the consumer. It feels different than anything that preceded it. And so will it also usher in a time of greater cooperation between payers? There's always been this incredible tension between payers in this vertically integrated world we have in the US of insurers and PBMs, but this feels like something that we can solve a problem together that will impact overall healthcare. So will it usher in a decade of better cooperation to bring overall costs down in healthcare? But we were hoping to open it up to the audience, but the conversation has been so robust. We are at time. I want to thank the panelists. Hopefully, since we didn't get to questions, maybe you can hang out a little bit afterwards to answer some questions, and also commend Leonard and Sachs Associates for having this first conference focused on obesity. I'm sure there will be many, many, many more to come as there's a lot more to unpack. So thank you guys, and thank you to the audience for listening.